reading today is from the book of Isaiah, one of the more popular of the old prophets. I will start with reading it, and then we're going to backtrack a little and talk about the context. Shout out and do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me, and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness, and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day, and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel, and to fight, and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose? A day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush, and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong, and you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interests on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, serving your own interests, pursuing your own affairs, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of your ancestor Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. It's a long reading, but you kind of have to get it all in there for the argument. So as I think I've mentioned before, Isaiah is 3 chunks that are written at 3 different time periods, right? The first chunk of Isaiah is pretty old. It's when Assyria was still top dog and they're going through crushing everyone. And Isaiah is warning the people of Israel and Judah about what's coming. The second part, and the part we often read at various times of the year, the more popular part, the second part of Isaiah comes from the very end of their time in captivity in Babylon, when the significant portion of the population from Judah was carted off as slaves to Babylon and forced to work there and live there and do various things. At the end of that period, when Babylon falls, the school of Isaiah here puts together the second piece. That's oracles convincing people to go back, to return to their homeland, to Jerusalem, to Judah, and to rebuild and to be the people that Jeremiah promised that they were going to be. That I know the plans I have for you, right? They're just 70 years out. Well, now it's time. That's second Isaiah. The third chunk of Isaiah that we're reading from today is after people have gone back and they've started rebuilding, and there's a lot of arguing about stuff. Because remember, it's been a long time, right? When Nebuchadnezzar took down Jerusalem and carted everybody back, they didn't leave the land empty. They left enough people there to work the fields and the mines. They brought in new people to do the work. Babylon still wanted all of the resources of the territory. So they still had it full of people. It just wasn't the people who were largely there or in charge before. And now, generations later, in a time where life expectancy is 40 at best, 70 years of captivity means that generations have come and gone. The people in Babylon have never lived in Judah before, and the people that are there, well, none of them remember a time when this was home to all these other people. So there is what amounts to an enormous humanitarian crisis of them trying to figure out who owns what. Well, my family lived here for generations. Well, your family hasn't been here for generations. So what does that mean? About trying to distribute resources, because you now have this huge population influx. They're trying to rebuild the temple, which is an incredibly labor-intensive and time-intensive and resource-intensive project. And people are trying to figure out, after generations of being under the thumb of Babylon, what does it mean to live this out again? Because they haven't been able to. They have copies of the documents, largely brought back from Babylon, from the scholars, all of whom were carted off. And so there's this enormous conflict between how do we arrange ourselves as a people, as a society, as a civilization. What do we do to make this work again? And what you end up with is two major trains of thought, which we have beautifully represented both sides in here. And on the one side you have things like Ezra and Nehemiah, these prophets that take a very harsh view of the world and say, look, we gotta take these, we gotta follow all the rules, and nobody's gonna help us. We're gonna do it all on our own. We're gonna get rid of everybody else that's contaminated. We're gonna redo all of the commands from our Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers stories. This is just our place, and we're gonna make it everything it can be. And on the other hand, you have things like Ruth and Jonah and a lot of Isaiah that say, maybe the fact that it didn't work out right the first time means we should try a slightly different approach to this. One that's a little bit more gentle, one that's a little bit more welcoming, one that's a little bit more caring and considerate. Because they had all of the rest of Isaiah, and they had the Psalms, and they had the other prophets that said, look at these terrible things that are done to people. God can't abide those things. And if we do them over again, it's still not going to go well for us. So, we get texts like this that talk about the distinction between performative religion, performative faith, doing the things that we're supposed to do, right? In particular here, they focus on fasting. There's other things, but in particular, these acts that one does because one's supposed to do them in order to appease and to satisfy and to show that one is a faithful and obedient servant. And on the other hand, there is this notion of true worship. We talked about this a little bit the other week with Micah, Malachi. Now I'm trying to remember which of those anyways. I sidebar, quick step out here. I end up writing about 3 sermons a week because I look at the different readings and I'm like, oh, I want to talk about this one. And then I basically write a sermon for it and go, nah, let's try one of the other readings. So sometimes it's hard for me to keep straight what I've talked about and what I just wrote up and then discarded. So my apologies. So instead, we have the fast, which is a foundational ancient practice, and one that is still done today, although not quite to the extent it often was in the ancient world. And there were specific practices that went along with fasting, like wearing sackcloth and lying in ashes and doing all of these things to kind of show your state. But God seems to feel like, oh, why? Why waste your time and energy doing these things that are fine as a ritual experience, as something to help bolster your faith, when you're ignoring all the stuff that I actually care about, like taking care of the hungry and the homeless and the naked, and not hiding yourself from your own kin. Don't push them off over there. We're all in this together. We're all in this together. So, instead, we need to figure out how to be faithful in a way that isn't just about doing the things we do. That isn't just about performing things that help convince ourselves that we're good, faithful people and help convince other people that we're good, faithful people, but to actually do the things God really cares about and wants. And this is relevant in its time. Absolutely. There is a crisis going on with all of these people trying to figure out who gets to live here and how do we feed everybody and how do we make that work. But that's not an isolated situation, is it? I mean, that's still a struggle that societies today struggle with. It's still a thing that people around us struggle with. And it's something that carries forward. One of the hard things about reading the Old Testament is that we often feel like, yeah, well, that was 3,000 years ago, and we have newer stuff, so why don't we just focus on the newer stuff, right? Why do we worry about what Isaiah said? Let's just dig into what Jesus said. And I don't have a problem with that, except Jesus tends to follow through with the things that the prophets of the others said, which is why we get all kinds of things in the New Testament talking about this. John the Baptist has this famous speech: if you have 2 coats, then you keep one and you give one away. If you have 2 loaves of bread, then one of those is for you and one of those is for somebody that doesn't have any. You get Jesus constantly feeding people. Feeding is like the only miracle story that happens in every one of the Gospels. I sometimes feel like we undervalue the fact that the one thing that all 4 Gospels want to talk about is how many people Jesus feeds. That's a big deal to them. I think then we get into the early church trying to interpret all of these texts, starting with the prophets, which they would have had. Remember, when the New Testament talks about scriptures, the New Testament hasn't been written yet, so they're talking about this stuff. And we get to early church leaders. I'm a particular fan of Basil the Great. I like to read a lot of early church writings, the first 400 years or so. So we're going to read a couple lines from Basil the Great talking about this idea. This is from a sermon of his. Does it have the date? I should give you an exact date if I can. No, I don't have a date for this exact one. But those who love their neighbor as themselves possess nothing more than their neighbor. I know many who fast, pray, sigh, and demonstrate every manner of piety so long as it costs them nothing, yet would not part with a penny to help those in distress. All right? So this is, Basil, I want to say, is 300s into the 400s. So we got 1,700 years. And then you get up into contemporary authors following the same trend line. I don't know if people here are fans of Brennan Manning or Shane Claiborne, both very good authors talking about what this stuff looks like today. It's really easy to get caught up in the language and the history and the situations of people 3,000 years ago, and it looks different enough where you can pretend that it's not the same thing. We don't need to worry. Well, there are people that make very, very good, produce very good ways of understanding how it fits today. We know that when the chips are down, if we love wildly enough, we'll fling life and caution to the winds for the one we love. But when it comes to God's love in the broken, blood-drenched body of Jesus Christ, we get antsy and start to talk about theology, divine justice, God's wrath, and heresies. Or, in the parable of the talents, the 3 servants are called to render an account of how they have used gifts entrusted to them. The first 2 used their talents boldly and resourcefully. The third, who prudently wraps his money and buries it, typifies the Christian who deposits their faith in a hermetic container and seals the lid shut. He or she limps through life on childhood memories of Sunday school and resolutely refuses to challenge the challenge of growth and spiritual maturity. Unwilling to take risks, this person loses the talent entrusted to him or her. The master wanted his servant to take risks. He wanted them to gamble with his money. We're supposed to go somewhere with this. That all these acts, these things that we do, our prayer and having a building and having worship services, the ritual enactments that we do of things, the fasting and all of the things that we don't do just to prove to ourselves that we're good people. We do, hopefully, ideally, as reminders, as ways of centering us on the things that God really wants us to do. That these are stories and reminders and methods and tools for us to transform the world. Not for us to just be comfortably confident in our faith. If we are never challenged, if we are never made uncomfortable, if we never break out of those cycles and those simple reenactments, we're missing the point. And all you have to do is go back to the source, and you can find all kinds of stories of people being reminded of the point. And today we are reminded of the point once again. Amen.